So when we use this term construct, you can think of it somewhat similar as Piaget's term schema, okay? It's a category almost of knowledge that you use to recognize certain events or objects or phenomenon, okay? Also, these constructs can change, they can be modified, okay, through adaptation, like Piaget said. They become more sophisticated, okay, and hopefully as you come in, as you experience more and more experiences, it'll reflect more and more accurately the true reality, okay, as you're accurately adapting the constructs that you have. He has a slightly more comprehensive conceptualization of what a construct is in comparison to Piaget's idea of a schema. We'll see that there's various characteristics that he's laid out that he thinks makes up what a construct is. So one of these, for example, is that it's bipolar in nature. That's kind of the most obvious one, or the easiest one to make sense of. So, when you're recognizing something, you quite often recognize it by comparing it to its opposite. It's not this, okay? And this is then how you can make sense of it. And I'm going to come back to that as we talk about these various different characteristics that he's laid out. And then at the core of the theory is this idea of construct alternativism, which is essentially that people are free to make their own constructs, okay? It's an ongoing process of building your constructs. Once they're formed, it's not then that they're, stable for life. Much like with Piaget's schemas, okay, through adaptation, okay, these can change. And according to Kelly, you have, what Adler would have said, creative power, okay? You have freedom, you have consciousness, ability in order to test the constructs that you currently have. If they're not working for you, if they're not making sense with reality, then you can modify them, okay? And then hopefully they'll become more and more sophisticated and more in line with reality. So these are the 11 characteristics that Kelly's laid out for what defines or constitutes a construct. So the first one is the construction characteristic. The fact that these constructs are made based upon perceived consistencies in our environment, okay? So in the past, this was always accompanied by this, or this was always a crucial element of this. And so then in the future, I'm going to predict that also these two things might be together. Or, in the past, cats that I recognized, they had whiskers, they had a tail. And so that's going to help me predict cats in the future, okay? Because that's a consistency, okay, that I'm identifying. So, for Kelly, these are how we then predict what's going to happen, how we make sense of things that we can then recognize in the outside world. The experience characteristic, that these are formulated and modified through experiences that we have, okay? Originally, through experiences is what helps create the construct initially, but also through new experiences, okay? They might be in line with the construct or might not be. Might mean that the construct is more solidified, or it might mean that it's time to modify it, okay? But experiences are going to have some impacts on the constructs we have. That they are dichotomous in nature. So, if you have an idea on what it means to be tidy, then that means that you're kind of comparing that characteristic to what it means to be messy or what it means to be untidy. If you're having a construct for what it means to be good, you're comparing that to what it means to be bad or to not be good, okay? So these are really helping us solidify and make clear the constructs that we have. And then organization, that, there can be a network, if you like, of these constructs being interlinked. If I want to, for example, decide if someone is a good person, then there might be kind of subordinate constructs that I look to. Is this person charitable? Are they compassionate? Are they friendly? And so on. And these things then may help me make sense of whether I think this person is good in terms of making that judgment. Okay, so these constructs can be interlinked in terms of, using one to have a perception of someone, then having an impact, okay, on using the other one to have a perception of the same person. They differ in terms of their range, okay, meaning that some characteristics or some constructs we're going to use frequently because there's a number of situations in which they're applicable. If it's to do with, for example, meeting people, then that might be one that you're using very often. But some constructs you have might be used much more infrequently, okay? Their applicability might be much more limited. Modulation, that they differ in permanence, okay? Meaning that some constructs we have might be harder to change. They might be a bit more rigid. Maybe they were formed earlier. Maybe they've had lots of experiences to back them up. And so they're not easily changed by future experiences. Whereas other constructs might be changed much more easily, okay? They might be less robust. They might be less fixed. We have freedom of choice, okay? Going back to that thing I said about creative power, okay? People have conscious awareness. They have the freedom to build and modify their own constructs. Individuality. Like I say, Kelly has a somewhat phenomenological viewpoint, meaning that people interpret reality slightly differently, okay? That we make sense of things, you know, not just objectively, but it's kind of an interaction, okay, as Piaget would have said, between the individual and the environment. So obviously, because of this, people's constructs will be somewhat unique, okay? They'll differ from person to person, and there's going to be this subjectivity, okay, when it comes to interpreting the world. But there is still commonality because we all come from the same culture, typically. And so there's going to then be commonalities, okay, based upon our shared experiences. And so we're going to interpret things in a pretty similar way many times, okay, in comparison to, for example, another culture, okay, that may have slightly different constructs. So there's going to be commonalities, okay, based upon communities or geographical areas. Fragmentation, meaning that some of these constructs can be inconsistent with one another because they're each potentially developed independently or uniquely, okay? So, you know, for example, maybe I have a construct, you know, to give an example in politics, maybe I have a construct that helps me make sense of political candidates or make my judgments on political candidates. Maybe I have a separate construct on what I think on a particular political issue, okay? Those two things don't have to be in agreement all the time, okay? Because those constructs arose independently, okay? So there can be room for some inconsistencies between constructs. And then sociality, okay, that these constructs are used for giving us a guide in social situations, and also they're heavily influenced, okay, by our social experiences as well. You know, we use these constructs to make sense or to make predictions over how we think people will react to us in social situations or how we think we should act in social situations. And then they can be heavily modified, okay, through experiences like this person didn't respond in the way I thought they would, okay, or I'm not being, you know, perceived in the way that I want to be perceived. And so then this might have a large influence on then modifying constructs to do with socializing. Okay, but like I say, Kelly was mainly a psychotherapist. You know, he didn't write a whole lot about his theory. He's mainly writing ideas to help inform his psychotherapy. And so he has a few techniques that he thinks are good techniques to use in psychotherapy. The first one is simply just interviewing the client, asking them what they think, what their perceptions are, what they think about themselves, what they think about the people around them, what they think about life, you know, just an interview kind of style in terms of getting to know them. But Kelly puts importance here on the fact that there might be denial, there might be distortions, and that the psychotherapist should feel free to kind of challenge some of those distortions, okay? So this is kind of like building the groundwork for cognitive behavioral therapy, okay, that I'm going to come to talk more about. The second one is a self-characterization sketch, which is simply asking the client to write about themselves in third person, okay? So, you know, if someone was to write about you, what would they write in a paragraph? And then, you know, maybe you would write, you know, so-and-so is a student at Clemson, they're majoring in this, they're from this state, and so on and so on. And, you know, this might give some insight into what does the client put importance on? You know, are they putting importance on their relationships? Are they defining themselves, for example, as, you know, this person is so-and-so's boyfriend or this person is so-and-so's daughter, or are they putting importance on their occupation? Is that the thing that they're most focusing on? That will give you some kind of insight in terms of how they kind of view themselves and how they define themselves and what they put importance on in their lives. The third one is the rep test, or the role construct repertory test. I'm going to give you a visualization of this on another slide, but it's essentially asking the client to list down all of the constructs that they can think of for evaluating people, and then they think of the people in their lives and think about how they measure up against that construct and how do they measure up against that construct as well. But I'll give you more example of that on the next slide. And then fixed role therapy, which is basically a kind of role play exercise. Okay, so you're the client, for example, and maybe you're worried about confronting your boss about this. Well, then let's try it out. Okay, maybe you be the boss, I'll be you. Let's see how it might go, and then maybe reverse the roles. For Kelly though, it was important that this didn't turn into a kind of character sketch. It was important it didn't go on too long. He only really wanted it to go on for a few minutes at most. But the idea here is a kind of basic role play exercise. Okay, so here's an example of the rep grid test. And I've put up a document on Canvas if you want to try it out yourself. But we probably won't have time today. But the client is asked to think about the important people in their life, which is these columns here. So maybe any spouse or any parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends, whoever they think is close in their life, and they'll begin listing those people. And then they're asked to think of, constructs, okay, like personality traits, okay, a kind of characteristic that someone might have or not. So this could be, being trustworthy, being honest, being charitable, being friendly, being sociable, and so on and so on. And then you're also asked to think about the contrast, okay, so what's the opposite of each of these constructs? So if the construct was, being charitable, then the contrast might be being selfish, right? Or if the construct was being honest, then the obvious contrast is being dishonest, right? So you have the construct, the contrast, and then you ask the client to rate each of these important people in their lives and themselves based upon whether the construct or the contrast best describes them. So in this example, maybe the dark color is being used to illustrate the construct and the light color is being used to illustrate the contrast. Okay, and then you're judging whether this person has this construct or not. Now, this can give some important insight. It could give insight into how does the client view themselves in relation to the people around them? Do they view themselves as being equal to those, or do they view themselves as being less than? And what do they think also of those that they're close to? Are they having troubles with a parent or with a spouse or with a friend? That's pretty obvious from the rep grid test results. That's the most obvious way of getting insight. Another way of getting insight is that there might be some unusual contrasts that the client chooses to use. So for example, maybe the construct is being competent, okay? The obvious contrast to that would be, being incompetent. Then maybe the contrast that the client uses is being questioning or being self-doubting. Maybe something like that is the contrast that they use. And that will tell you something, right? If they think that that's the opposite of being competent, then they're probably thinking of that right now as being a negative thing for a reason. It might be the case that that's something to do with what they're insecure about. So that could be one way also of getting insight. But also, as I'll go on to show you from research, people tend to think most initially about constructs that they think describe them or that they think people are using to judge them. So for example, people who are incredibly anxious, that's one of the first constructs that they'll think of. And, when judging people, they'll be thinking, is this person anxious? Is this person not anxious? Okay, because for them, that's a part of how they identify. And they also worry maybe about being judged for being anxious. So that's also another way of getting insight. Now, the rep grid test has had somewhat of a big impact in psychology. It's used in psychotherapy practices. And also, actually, it's had impact in the field of marketing as well. Companies will often bring in a focus group and then ask them to begin listing all of the products within a particular category. Think of all of the constructs related to it. And then that may be used for helping them judge what constructs are valued and then helping them with their plans for a future product. So maybe it's a candy bar company, they asking the focus group to begin listing candy bars in these columns, and then constructs like whether it's caramelly, whether it's nutty, so on and so on. And then that will give them maybe some insight also into terms of what's being valued. So it's actually being used outside psychology, even though it was developed for psychotherapy reasons. Okay, so what the research on Kelly's rep grid tells us is that it does give us quite good insights in terms of how people might describe other people's characteristics and the characteristics of themselves, including even characteristics not included by the big 5 questionnaires. Okay. People use constructs that are more complicated as they get older. And this is an interesting one, that we tend to make friends with people who already have constructs similar to us. So in this particular study, they asked freshmen in college on their first day to begin listing constructs like you would have seen there on the rep grid test. And then they did so again at the end of their senior year. And then they compared this to the friends that they had made across college. Now, the constructs that they had with their friends were similar on the very first day of freshman year. So it wasn't the case that they developed constructs that were similar to those they were already hanging around with and so on. They initially made friendships with those who already had similar constructs. Spouses tend to report greater happiness when their constructs are more alike. And then, yeah, people construe people in relation to their own constructs. So the example I gave you was, if an anxious person will often judge people on whether they're anxious or not, but also someone who is depressed, might judge someone on whether they're happy or sad. A big major characteristics of ourselves, again, is something that we're using to judge others, and one of the first constructs that we'll think of. Schizophrenics in one study were less consistent when construing other people in relation to non-schizophrenic controls. And then, like I said, it's also been used in fields outside psychology. Okay, so in terms of maybe evaluating Kelly's theory, okay, it's an important building block in terms of then giving rise to the cognitive theories that came after, particularly CBT. It's maybe having some limitations with it. First of all, it's viewing people as very rational beings, right? The fact that people try to process problems as logically as possible, that they try to predict, how things are going to turn out. And then if things don't turn out the way expected, they then adapt. Okay, they kind of rethink the scenario. You can think, is that really in line with your, experience with people? Are people really that rational and that logical in terms of how they approach life, in terms of how they approach all experiences and so on? Are people really that self-aware, as Kelly's kind of giving them credit for? And also, he's putting really only focus on the conscious level, not really any focus on maybe unconscious influence. And we've looked at the fact that, that has at least some influence. But like I say, the cognitive theories, particularly those by Ellis and Beck, really revolutionized, the field of psychotherapy. And CBT is now by far the most common type of therapy in modern day psychology. Ellis's ABC approach to therapy is a pretty basic idea that I'll give you an example from. And then Beck's CBT, okay, is a bit more sophisticated and is what's become incredibly popular. Okay, but in Ellis's ABC theory of personality, there is an activating event, which is A. And then let's just talk about C first, okay, which is the emotional consequences. So, for example, maybe someone with social anxiety, okay, for A, their A would be a social situation, right? And their C would be anxiety. So the social situation is what's activating the emotional response, the emotional consequence, which in this case is anxiety. Now, in Ellis's idea, people with disorders, phobias, conditions, anxieties, and so on, they quite often think that A goes directly onto C, okay? They're not really thinking about the fact that there is something in between, okay, which is their thinking styles. So that's B, okay? So, you know, the fact that maybe they are ruminating on things that they don't have to be ruminating on that might cause them depression, or the fact that they're worrying, what does this person think of me? What's this person, you know, looking at right now? And then that's actually what's causing the anxiety, okay? It's not the social situation itself, okay? It's the thoughts that they're having in a social situation. That's what's giving rise to the emotional consequences. So this approach to therapy was really about having the clients understand this, okay? Recognize that it's the beliefs that are actually what's causing the emotional consequences, and then somewhat challenging those beliefs. You know, I mean, are you, you know, focusing on the people around you all the time, you know, and so probably not. And so does it really make sense that everyone's focusing on you all the time? So, you know, some of these thoughts that you have are not really rational, is the kind of takeaway point. So yeah, the goal is we have a negative event that maybe leads to irrational beliefs, then an unhealthy emotional consequence. The goal is to help the client, you know, change their thought processes in response to particular events, which will then help with their emotional reactions. And you know, it could be used for phobias as well. You know, for example, maybe someone has a fear of flying, and they think that, you know, being on the plane is what causes their emotional consequences of fear and anxiety. But actually, maybe there's, you know, thoughts that they're having about worrying over this and worrying over that going wrong. And it's actually these irrational thoughts that are really what's causing the fear and anxiety. And then, you know, heavily based upon this then is cognitive behavioral therapy by Beck. And the goal here is through a conversational style, you know, through building rapport and making the person feel as though they're in a safe place and their views and so on are not being, you know, directly challenged in a uncomfortable way. To then again have them, you know, reconsider maybe distortions that they might have. And I'm going to give you some particular examples of distortions, but you know, it could be, for example, negative filtering, you know, viewing things through a negative lens, always focusing on the negative and always worrying about the worst thing happening. Okay. Beck originally developed this to help with depression, but it's since been used for a number of other conditions. Agoraphobia, so a fear of leaving your home, bipolar disorder, eating disorders, social phobias, generalized anxiety, smoking. And a number of these cases, the benefits have been at least equal to medication. Now, obviously, the advantage of CBT over medication is that medication is only beneficial so long as the person is still taking the medication, okay? Whereas for CBT, what the results show is that even once the person is no longer going to therapy, there is still long-lasting positive effects, okay? So there's a massive list of cognitive distortions. I can't possibly cover them all, but I'm going to give you a video, okay, that shows you some clips from TV shows and so on, that gives you some examples of some of these distortions. Write down some of the ones that you identify, okay, and then on the next slide, I'll go over some of the most common ones and, you know, some of the ones brought up in this video. Okay, so there's quite a number of them. Some clear examples there. We have all or nothing thinking, right? Thinking of yourself in terms of black or white, right? I didn't do this successfully, therefore I'm a total loser, okay? Not really, well, just putting yourself in like one of those categories, right? Not having a more sophisticated view on it. Overgeneralizing, you know, maybe I'm terrible in group situations, for example. Well, you know, maybe, one group situation didn't go all that well for you, and now you're kind of overgeneralizing, assuming that, in all group situations, maybe something bad's going to happen again, and that's what's causing your anxiety. We have negative filtering or discounting the positives. So, maybe you've done something really well, but you tell yourself, well, I just got lucky. Okay, instead of, giving recognition to all of the hard work and effort that you put into it. Okay, you're just discounting it. Or, maybe it rains and ruins the whole weekend when, you still maybe could have found, something enjoyable to do. And maybe it didn't, actually rain the whole time. Okay, maybe there was times in which you actually could have maybe done what you wanted. Mind reading, fortune telling. You pass someone, they say, or you say hi, they don't say hi back. You think, well, they must dislike me, but maybe they just didn't hear you, or maybe there's some other reason for it. But assuming that you know what the person thinks about you, and assuming it's going to be something negative. Or in the examples there, right? It was George thinking that his girlfriend was going to break up because of a voicemail message that he got. Magnification, treating pretty minor problems maybe as big, massive ones. So, maybe someone asked you for directions and you didn't give the best directions, and then you're worrying about that all day. Oh, how did I give that person such bad directions? But in reality, it was probably a minor inconvenience at most, right, for that person. Emotional reasoning. Okay, so assuming that because you feel this way, there must be a good reason for it, right? I don't know the movie, but in the clip there, she was beginning to feel anxious and insecure, and therefore she thought that there was good reason for it, right? Or quite often people with a flight phobia, okay, will begin to think that once they're beginning to feel anxious, then something bad is going to happen, okay? That's telling them that something bad is going to happen. Should statements, so the tyranny of the shoulds that we covered with Karen Horney, right? That you should be this, you should do this. And if you're not living up to that, then viewing yourself negatively as a consequence. Labeling, so again, just kind of giving yourself one simple label to describe yourself, right? I'm a total outcast, or I'm a total loser, okay? And then personalizing, okay? You accepting the blame, okay? So for example, because of me, we lost the game, when of course it was, a team effort. So it can't just have been you that was responsible for losing the game. Or in the clips, it was Miss Incredible, right? Assuming that she was responsible for her husband withdrawing from her, okay, rather than, putting any blame on him, thinking it must all be because of something that she did. Okay, so, cognitive behavioral therapy is really about challenging these distortions, okay, helping the person think about things more healthily, believing that that will then help them behave more healthily and feel more healthy psychologically, okay, in future situations. So this mainly follows 3 steps. First of all, making the person aware of the cognitive distortions. And this would be through, gentle challenging, So, why is it you feel you have to be this way? Why is it that you think people will think of you like that, okay, if this doesn't go well? I do have a video clip. I won't have time to show it, but I really recommend it. It's a good example of CBT in action. And then the second stage is then having the person monitor those distortions. What situations is it in which these distortions are more likely to occur? Is it when you're around certain people? Is it when you're in a certain environment? Is it under certain situations? And then that would then help you identify future situations in which these distortions might then come to the surface. And then the third stage, adapting, okay? Changing your thinking styles, changing your cognitive patterns, the way that you think about yourself, things, relationships, and then hoping that that will have a positive impact going forward. So this is about a 10-minute example of CBT. I really think it's a good example of CBT in action, and you can check it out in your own time to see it. Okay, I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to do this small exercise. Okay, you know, if you've taken my forensic psychology class, what you'll know is that we find cognitive distortions, particularly in offenders, and quite often a big part of rehabilitation is CBT, challenging those distortions. Okay. What I'd like you to do for just one or 2 minutes, okay, just think in your pairs or in small groups, what do you think might be some of the common distortions that we might find in criminals? And how do you think those distortions might facilitate or lead to criminal behavior? Okay.